Good morning. I'm David Wessel, Director of the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy. Welcome to our almost all-day conference on opportunity zones, the early evidence. Opportunity zones, as I suspect everybody who's dialed into this event knows, is a provision of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017 that provides capital gains incentives for people who invest under certain conditions in one of 8,766 designated opportunity zones. I've been interested in opportunity zones for quite a while. I'm finishing up a book on how they happen to come to be in this law and what the early anecdotal evidence is. And in the course of reporting this book, I found that there were a number of researchers, many of them academics, who've been working on the early evidence. And so the point of this conference today is not to deal too much with the politics of the opportunity zones, or despite some questions I've got, to give people investment advice. We'll do that in another forum. The point here is to bring together researchers who are doing rigorous research on trying to come up at this early stage with some kind of evaluation of how opportunity zones are working. One person sent me an email and said, "What do you mean by rigorous research?" I thought it was obvious, but what I mean is research that is not advocacy, research that looks at the data and tries to see what we can see so far, and importantly, I think gives us a template to evaluate opportunity zones as they mature, and particularly, I hope, as we get much more data on how they've worked. Hopefully we'll get more reporting requirements so that we can see a lot more. So we have a long day. But it's organized in various topics. And we're going to start with two opening presentations. And first, I'd like to introduce Ed Glaeser, who is a distinguished economist at Harvard, who's done a lot of work on urban history and the urban economy, and has thought a lot about place-based policies. Ed's going to talk for about 15 minutes, then we'll have another presentation, and then we'll get into our academic presentation. So Ed, the floor or the screen is yours.
Thank you, David. I'm so glad that I'm not providing an academic presentation. So that's a key thing for this opening. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm really grateful for David for including me and for organizing this session. So I don't think of this conference as actually being about opportunity zones alone. I think that opportunity zones are an avenue, are a means for us to learn about place-based policies more generally. And that will become increasingly crucial, I think, in the years ahead, because I think it will be impossible for the Biden administration and for administrations to come not to have the urge to want to do something about the enormous differences in economic outcomes across the United States. Now, of course, America has always been a place of remarkable economic heterogeneity. In 1950, Mississippi was the poorest state in the Union, and there was not a single state. And there were 18 states that had per capita incomes that were double that of Mississippi. Today, those income differences differences have declined, and now there's not a single state with income that is double that in Mississippi. Mississippi is still the poorest state, but we've seen the rise of long-term mass non-employment for prime-aged males, and that is a very spatially concentrated phenomenon. I think it's also arguably among America's largest unsolved social problems. So when I was born in 1967, roughly 5% of America's prime-aged males were jobless. Now, 53 years later, pushing me to the edge of the prime-age definition, to which I strongly object. Now, for most of the past 10 years, more than 15% of prime-age males have been jobless. And of course, that is not a spatially neutral thing. There are pockets of America's eastern heartland, that swath of states that begins in Louisiana and Mississippi, runs up through Appalachia, and concludes in the north in America's Rust Belt cities, where 1 in 4 prime-age men are jobless, and you can really see these divergences. Now, of course, it's partially related to the decline of manufacturing, and this just shows where manufacturing employment was in 1980. But it's also true that it's abundant in the less skilled parts of the Deep South where there wasn't manufacturing. And you also saw, of course, high levels of joblessness in the far west, in New Mexico and Arizona. This is what the geography looked like in 1980 using the same color scheme. It's a very different map. The same areas, Appalachia is still very high. Of course, Appalachia is where America's place-based policies begin with the Appalachian Regional Commission in the 1960s. And even then it was very high, but most of the Eastern Heartland is much lower. because, of course, American joblessness was much lower as a whole. And of course, I emphasized men because non-employment, labor force participation typically means different things for men and for women. There are certainly women who have left the labor force, particularly over this past terrible year, in which they're leaving the labor force is at least as tragic, if not more so, than anything that's happened to men. But in many cases, it just means a different thing. And women who don't work often do things that are socially productive, like caring for children, caring for family members, and they're not miserable. Whereas men who don't work typically watch an extra, 3 hours of television a day and tend to be deeply unhappy. This just shows the very different spatial pattern. It's a much more north-south spatial pattern. Of course, the Eastern Heartland is also one of the centerpieces of America's opioid consumption, and you can see the sort of place-based area of where the opioid pandemic occurred. You can see the Eastern Heartland is also heavy in terms of government expenditures. And one of the reasons to worry about joblessness is, of course, there is an externality that was pointed out by Pigou himself over 100 years ago, that when people choose not to work, they impose costs on their fellow taxpayers. By acquiring government support and by not paying taxes. You can see also, of course, that there are high levels of government expenditure per capita in those states like North Dakota. They're very well endowed with senators per capita. So what are the arguments for place-based policies? I think there are really three, and they wax and wane in popularity. The first is that there is some form of a place-based externality, perhaps a human capital externality of getting more skilled people in the area, perhaps an agglomeration economy that creates the possibility of a virtuous circle, which if only we could get more people in West Virginia, more people would then come, and West Virginia would be fantastic. It is pretty fantastic as it is now, but its economics doldrums are more problematic. I think by most urbanists, we tend to accept the existence of agglomeration economies. Congestion economies are also quite real, pollution, traffic, etc. Human capital externalities are slightly more contentious, but I certainly basically believe the results of Enrico Moretti and others that, when the share of adults with a college degree in your area increases by 10%, your earnings go up by 10%, holding your years of schooling constant. These externalities seem to imply that a decentralized spatial equilibrium is unlikely to be a social optimum. But I certainly am skeptical about this justification because I don't think we know, and I don't think we're ever likely to know enough about the shape of those externality curves, of the convexity or concavity of these things, which is what you need to move people around. Should we move New Yorkers to West Virginia, or should we move West Virginians to New York? It's unlikely that we currently are in the first best, but we're not even sure which way we want to move people. And I think the best form of identification strategies, like the $1 million plants or using soil attributes, seem unlikely to nail the full set of functional forms needed to implement this. Okay. Place-based argument number two is insurance or equity or tagging. And so the simplest way to think about this is in 1969, Detroit was slightly richer than Boston. Today, Boston's income is 40% higher, right? So surely insuring people against shocks to the local economy could be welfare improving, right? If you did it based on place of birth and changes in income after place of birth, that's pretty non-distortionary. It would probably achieve some equity gains, but place of birth is pretty inconceivable as a policy, right? And the big limitation is that if you did things on states only explain 1.2% of income variability across the US. Public use microsample areas, which are considerably smaller, explain 7.1%. But if you made any subsidy, any sort of aid contingent upon where you currently live, you will be moving people around to take advantage of these extra bonuses. And it is far from obvious that we think that artificially inducing people to locate to areas where economic productivity is lower, it's far from obvious that that's a desirable thing to do. Place-based policy number three, which is the different elasticities of different local conditions should mean different policies. So I have long thought that it is madness to have the same form of housing policies in a place like Texas, where housing supply is completely elastic, as in a place like California, where it's highly restricted, right? Different local economies call for different housing subsidies, right? Similarly, and technically, right, you want to subsidize more production in places like New York or Boston or California, where housing supply is highly restricted, and you want to perhaps use vouchers more in places like Texas, where supply is unrestricted. Similarly, if you've got a limited resource like the amount of cops, almost all of the research on policing tends to think that putting more cops in areas where there's more crime is an efficient use of those resources. Similarly, if you had a modest amount of money to use on dealing with the joblessness problem, it might make more sense to spend more of that money in areas where there were more joblessness. So the argument that we've made is that sort of this is with Ben Austin and Larry Summers, that in high employment markets, policies that deter employment may not make so much of a difference in Seattle, whereas in West Virginia it could be much worse. And I think certainly as we confront things like a $15 minimum wage, right, we have to ask ourselves, will that really have a non-effect in Eastern Kentucky, in Eastern Tennessee, the way that it seems to have done in Seattle? Okay, now let's pivot to opportunity zones versus empowerment zones. And this, in some senses, is sort of the critical thing for us to think about in terms of opportunity zones, at least from my perspective. Empowerment zones were very targeted towards hiring people, right? They were, and I bolded the main part. It's a tax credit for up to $3,000 per year for each of its employees who reside in the empowerment zone. So this was our strategy. It was very oriented towards work. And that indeed was where I would have started, given my focus on joblessness as being this sort of huge spatial problem. Opportunity zones, this is just from the IRS page. I think David said the key features better than I did. This is basically a subsidy to capital investment. It is not at all tied to the number of workers that you hire or anything else that you're doing in the area. So conceptually, right, you really got to think that there's a very strong complementarity between capital and labor if you think the point of this is to lead to employment. Now, maybe the point of it isn't to lead to employment. Maybe you think that there are externalities from a failure to maintain decaying structures in these declining areas. Maybe that's what you're after. But at least we should be very clear about what we think is going to happen, right? One of the great tragedies of place-based policy over the past 50 years is the use of place-based arguments to justify all sorts of things, like, for example, a monorail in Detroit, which really had no business being justified as a place-based policy. Rails, like most other forms of transportation, are best evaluated as whether or not they are delivering enough value to their users to actually get people to move around. So the question is whether or not subsidizing capital investment is actually the right response to America's geographic sclerosis, and I look forward to learning this. Now, over the past 20 years, I have become, particularly over the past 5 years, I've become friendlier to the possibility, at the very least, of place-based targeting, which is having policies that are targeted to particular areas, and perhaps even place-based policies more generally. And part of that is that America has changed. We have become a place with far more geographic sclerosis than we had in the past. So this is seen in the decline in migration, and I think of this as being the work of Raven Sachs-Malloy and Abby Wozniak. And you can see this in intra-county migration and inter-county migration. A related issue is, of course, the decline in business dynamism, which has been widely studied and widely discussed, but we are much less a place on the move. So whereas 30 years ago, it was possible to say, well, people left Oklahoma to move to San Francisco, to move to California in the 20s and 30s. People left the scrubby farmland of New England to move to the Ohio River Basin in the 1830s. America has always been a nation on the move, so why should we try to bail up declining places rather than allowing people to move? That movement becomes less attractive and less plausible. Second, when we do see movement, it is the skilled who move out. Okay, this shows the college graduation rate across areas of non-migrants on the college graduation rate of migrants. And you see a huge gap between the 45-degree line, which tells you that the out migrants are just moving out a lot more. The college graduates are moving out much more than the non-college graduates. So as this migration process occurs, what they're leaving behind is an area that is denuded of its human capital that provides typically the anchor and the bedrock for local success. Added changes. Migration, especially migration of the less skilled, is not directed towards high-wage areas. That's the work of Kenan and Shoag. Successful areas make it increasingly difficult to build low-cost housing, which leads to a spatial mismatch between where people live and where productivity is. The change in the share with college degrees is very strongly positively associated with the initial share of the population with the college degree. So we're seeing increasing divergence of skills across place. Income convergence across metropolitan areas, which was a feature of America for 130 years, particularly documented in a Brookings paper by Robert Barrow and Xavier Martin 30 years ago. That basically disappeared at exactly the moment where Barrow and Sally Martin documented it. And over the past 30 years, we really have not seen poor areas catching up with Mississippi caught up between 1950 and today. This is the stalling of income convergence, right? So it's a very weak effect. And the incredible permanence of not working rates. So this is at the state level, and this is at the Puma level. So this just shows the extent to which, if you had a higher rate of not working, prime age men not working in 1980, you had a higher rate of not working today. So America's move less. We don't move in a directed way, partially because high housing costs in places like San Francisco make it difficult to move, and our not working rates are really permanent. So we're looking at places that have sort of permanent joblessness. And perhaps that does call for a bit more place-based policies. So let's run through our counter arguments for place-based policies, and think about why these things relate. So counter argument number one: subsidizing declining places keeps people in dysfunctional local economies. That's less important with a lower migration rate. Counter argument number two: subsidizing any place leads to capitalization in local housing prices. The poor tenement who doesn't like contemporary art may well be hurt by Guggenheim Bilbao. Again, less mobility means that fewer people are going to be around to bid up those rents. So the relative importance of capitalization versus distorted migration depends on housing supply elasticity. So if the housing supply is fixed and people are going to be occupying those houses, you're not going to be changing the number of people who live areas, but you are going to be changing the prices. And if housing supply is more flexible, then you're going to be changing people more. Counter argument number three: some place-based policies can create pockets of unemployment and low human capital. So there you really have to ask yourself what you're doing with your place-based policy. So are you doing so in a way that's going to particularly attract less skilled people or more skilled people? And counter argument number four is that infrastructure-based policies, and there is a sense in which opportunity zones are about private infrastructure, right? I mean, a lot of it is about structures. They certainly can lead to monumental waste of building in places that are, very far from where the people are who need that infrastructure. And I think as we watch the Biden administration's enthusiasm for infrastructure, we're going to have to be careful lest it, try to be used for these economic goals, which have often led to things like this, of course, Detroit's People Mover monorail, which glides in majestic silence over near empty streets, right? And is a classic example of a white elephant project. Just to end on sort of two examples of things that go wrong and go right. So this is the Bilbao Guggenheim, right? A beautiful building, at least many people think, and certainly an artistic destination. But remember, despite this alleged success of this placemaking, Bilbao's unemployment rate was still 19% before COVID-19. So, even though this is seen as being the best case for these museums for placemaking, it still doesn't seem to have fixed Bilbao's underlying structural employment problem. And of course, that museum is a good museum, right? Sheffield's National Center for Popular Music, another example for placemaking, closed quickly and wasn't able to attract any visitors either. So not only did it fail to do placemaking, it even failed at its basic job of being a museum. So I am delighted to have the opportunity to learn from everything today. And I just want to reiterate the point: it is absolutely unavoidable that we will have more discussions about placemaking policies over the next 3 to 4 years. America's spatial inequalities have gone up. Our geographic sclerosis has made the case for place-based policies better, but it is still possible to screw it up enormously, right? And so that's why, as David said, a rigorous social science approach to things like opportunity zones are absolutely crucial for helping us to make the best policy decisions on these policies going forward. Thank you, David. Back over to you.
Thank you very much, Ed. I want to assure everybody that when we post the video, you can post it at 0.75 or 0.5 if it's not too fast for you. I really appreciate your perspective. We're now going to turn to Kenan Fikri, who's now research director at the Economic Innovation Group, which actually is responsible largely for opportunity zones. It helped devise them and helped in a very successful lobbying effort to get them enacted by Congress. Kenan has been at the EIG for the last 5 years or so, and before that, he was actually at Brookings. So, Kenan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, David. Let me get this. Let's see, slides should be up. Am I good?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, so thanks so much for the chance to speak to everyone today. Really pleased to be here and kind of share our perspective on the opportunity zones marketplace and how it's evolving, given our kind of front row seat to the whole process from incubation through implementation. And I think I'll start by acknowledging that the kind of national narrative around opportunity zones has not been particularly positive since it was enacted into law. And actually that stands in pretty stark contrast to the narrative if you end up kind of reading local press which is much more focused on kind of the more prosaic and mundane everyday work of like actual investments getting made into communities, actual deals getting done, and places really seeing promise and impacts from the policy, which stands in pretty stark contrast to the things on the left, which were generally about associations of seemingly scandalous things happening in zones, but nothing actually taking advantage of the incentive officially. My presentation today will very much be in the vein of kind of the more bottom-up perspective there on the right-hand side of the screen. Now, what makes OZs so unique in kind of the history of economic and community development policies that we've enacted at the federal level? So one is the real specific focus on equity capital. We have other tools out there that kind of provide subsistence capital to low-income communities and struggling areas, but that real growth-oriented kind of catalytic capital that is meant to start to kind of seed a rebound in a community is scarcer, and that's what Opportunity Zones attempts to unlock. It's also designed to change behavior, given that its potential benefit to investors is tied to their long-term potential capital gains. So it tries to challenge folks with money who make investment decisions that can determine the fates of communities and regions in the United States to take a second look at the map, see where there may be inherent potential in the communities that they've chronically kind of overlooked or disinvested from or underinvested in. And it very proactively embraces flexibility. Many other tools out there deliver a particular product, like low-income housing, for example, but Opportunity Zones instead, meant to create a widely available tool that the market would deploy and determine kind of where and how it gets utilized in a very decentralized way, which is a real significant pivot. And I think it was embraced because since that the problem was just getting worse and we needed to try kind of a wide open approach. Now, the market is really accelerating quite rapidly, especially since final regulations were issued at the end of 2019. This data from Novogradac and Company, which conducts a survey of Opportunity Zone managers, it presents just one window on the marketplace, but we think its trajectory is representative of the true kind of amount of money that OZs is moving, which is a couple multiples larger than what you see here. Most folks will agree. And we saw that the volume of equity investment in OZs actually more than tripled over the course of 2020. So we are still very much in the early stages of Opportunity Zones, as David said, even in the fundraising side of things. Now at EIG, we have a product on our website that tries to track some of the most interesting and novel use cases of the Opportunity Zones incentive out there in the country. So it's important to kind of level set that the vast majority of, not vast majority, but the clear majority of investments so far, based on the best available information, have been in residential rental real estate. That's a big section of the market right now, and we'll see kind of where that settles as the market matures. But underneath that, there has been a real flourishing of much more diversity, where we see things like rural broadband in Maine to affordable housing in different parts of the country, to minority business incubators, and even kind of vertical farming, helping to reinvent the old Pennsylvania steel towns. And promisingly, we're also starting to see a number of investments into startup companies in parts of the country that you might not normally expect, such as water technology in Blacksburg, Virginia, space in the western slope of Colorado, and cybersecurity in Erie, Pennsylvania. And one thing that's also clear is that local institutions really matter in Opportunity Zones. They are helping foster investment ecosystems into being. Again, this is very decentralized, and there are a lot of kind of actors to try to wrangle, to try to turn this into actual impact in your community. And organizations like Opportunity Alabama or the Erie Downtown Development Corporation or the economic development arm in the state of Colorado have been very proactive in kind of establishing their local goals around Opportunity Zones, kind of creating supportive programming around it, and driving impact. And it makes a difference. And we're going to hear from Ben Siegel in Baltimore later today, who has a similar kind of one-man role in the Baltimore Development Corporation, doing exactly this work. Now, we did some deep dive work into the state of Indiana last year, And I wanted to present that again here too, because I think it's important for this conversation for researchers, because it shows that opportunity zones are really unlike many of the other, at least urban kind of community development incentives that we've studied in the United States that are, again, more focused around just hiring people or just delivering a product like affordable housing. Here, we have real small scale investments into historic preservation in small cities like Michigan City, alongside really massive brownfield remediations in Gary and East Chicago. We have housing at all different levels of the market, all different price points in urban and rural regions and communities of all sizes. We have clean tech manufacturing expansions in Fort Wayne being financed through opportunity zones incentives. And we have local investors in really small towns in places like Brookville that are using their own capital gains to help revitalize main streets and bring housing downtowns, and even in that case, save the local newspaper. So this diversity of investments, they're all from the same policy, but each one of these will have very different local impacts when we're talking about what metrics they impact, the scale of their footprint, and the timing. I think that we can expect to see them actually register at the community level. So these challenges compound on top of the situation facing researchers that we don't have good systematic data on what opportunity zones are financing out there in the country today. We don't even know how much money has actually moved at this point, let alone how many census tracts have seen investment. And this is because when opportunity zones were passed into law in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, that was passed by a reconciliation and let opportunity zones, serve as a warning that there are real costs to attempting to pass complex policy via reconciliation. And the envisioned kind of reporting requirements and data collection regime that we all thought would be part of the OZ experiment was stripped out and hasn't been restored yet. So that's forced the researchers we're going to hear from today to get really creative. And as we're designing studies around opportunity zones, some things that I think are really important to keep in mind, just based on what we're seeing in the market, is that the timing and sequencing of events really matters. And again, investment didn't start to flow significantly, and the market didn't really mature until 2020. And there was really no ability to invest confidently into operating businesses in all of 2019, just because those regulations weren't finalized until December. So that's going to matter in the impacts that we see. It also, investors in normal times have 180 days to actually deploy the money. The pandemic extended that even further, that massive fundraising of 2020. And then even if you look at maybe what was financed in the first wave in 2019, much of that was real estate, and it takes time to substantially rehabilitate a property. It takes time to build one, sometimes 2 years, sometimes more. So much of what we've seen so far might not even really be economically active out there in the economy until this year. And some other challenges revolve around the idea of heterogeneity in that both around the zones themselves and in the types of investments that are coming into communities. In that work in Indiana, we found that only 30% of opportunity zones were actually predominantly residential. So almost half were mixed use, some were just city center, some were almost exclusively rural. And this is going to matter, I think, in how we hypothesize the economic impact is going to take root locally. Similarly, their treatment's going to be different depending on what type of investments they receive. We should also keep in mind that some of the big impacts of OZs may be indirect in the spillovers that they have beyond the initial investment and in the neighborhood effects, and those things take real time to evaluate and track. And then finally, on this front, the qualitative component I think is going to really, really matter in controlling for parts of the country that had these strong institutions that were very active in shaping kind of community-oriented or goal-focused opportunity zone ecosystems. Now, kind of where are we 3 years into the life of opportunity zones? From where we're sitting, and again, advocacy hat on, but we think that the policy really does show considerable promise in the model in kind of the range of use cases that we're seeing out there and in the range of communities reached. I think we would like to see more zones actually get OZ investment. Again, we don't know how many places have received any money through opportunity zones yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's actually under half at this point. So we haven't defined success on that point yet, but there's definitely room for more places to find themselves in this experiment. And again, I think there's definitely wide room to diversify off of right now the predominantly real estate focused base. And there's still some unfinished business from OZ's initial passage that we are busy advocating for and working with congressional partners in the Biden administration to help finally put that data collection and reporting regime in place. And let's do some other housekeeping, like sunset the high income census tracts that never should have been nominated as opportunity zones, improve alignment with some other federal tools to make sure that we get as much kind of impactful stuff as possible, and some other things. And then finally, to close, I think this will be a theme of the day, but the data and evaluation is essential. So all the work that people are doing on this at this conference is really critical to help us learn from this really unprecedentedly open-ended experiment in place-based policy. If we have the data collection regime in place, we're going to get so many observations out there from what this wide open tool accomplishes in the disaggregated marketplace, where it works, where it doesn't, that this may inform a whole future generation of place-based policies, in addition to kind of the continued tweaking of opportunity zones themselves. So I will rest the floor, and again, David will probably tell you to give you the timestamp because I probably talked too fast, but thank you very much.
Now, I think Ed's got you beat on talking fast. But thanks, Kenan, that was great. So I want to explain a little bit about what we're doing here and what the order of the day is. We put out a broad call for papers to people who are doing empirical research on opportunity zones. We have one session on choosing the zones, which I'll talk to in a minute. Another that looks primarily at the labor market effects. That's at 11:40 this morning. At 1:40 p.m., we're going to do a couple of case studies, one on Washington, D.C. and one on Baltimore. And then at 2:30, we're going to look at the effect on property prices. And the idea was to try and bring together people who are working on these questions to kind of road test their empirical work. Even if it's too early to make conclusions, we do have some early results. As Kenan points out, we don't have a lot of data, so we have to work with the data we have. But I think importantly, this will be a template for how to evaluate opportunity zones as we go forward. A number of people are in our Zoom room, and when we get done with the presentations, I will ask them if they want to speak, and they can raise their hand and we can hear their voices. If you're watching on outside the Zoom room, please feel free to email a question to events@brookings.edu or on Twitter at #OpportunityZones. Now, we have a number of questions that are kind of factual about opportunity zones. Some are about investment issues. Some are about what the Biden administration is going to do. We're not going to answer those today, probably. We might do a Q&A online, but we will do another conference later in the year that's more focused on what's happening on the ground and what's happening in Congress. Today is really focused on what's happening among academic researchers. So our first session is about how the zones were chosen. The law had some criteria. The Treasury refined them a bit, but ultimately governors had to decide from which of the zones in their state, up to 1/4 of the zones that were eligible, could be designated as opportunity zones. The decisions were some good ones, some bad ones. There is no flexibility in the law as there is now. An opportunity zone is an opportunity zone. A governor can't undo a mistake that he or she made and replace it, although, as Kenan said, there are proposals in Congress to do so. So we have two papers now that look at how did governors actually go about choosing those. The first one is by Mary Margaret Frank at UVA, Jeffrey Hoops at UNC, and Rebecca Lester at Stanford. She will present for them. Then we're going to have a presentation by Ofer Eldar at Duke and Chelsea Garber at Duke on a similar question. And then I've asked Brent Theodos at the Urban Institute, who has been a student of opportunity zones since the very beginning, to comment on the two papers, and then we'll have time for some discussion and Q&A. So with that, I'd like to turn the screen over to Rebecca Lester to present the first paper.
Super. Thanks so much for the chance to be included in the schedule today. I'm really looking forward to hearing about the rest of the research that's happening in the space. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. And confirm, do you see my slides?
We do.
All set? Okay, super. Okay, so the title of our paper is What Determines Where Opportunity Knocks? Political Affiliation in the Selection and Early Effects of Opportunity Zones. So as David mentioned, this paper is primarily going to study the factors that were associated and influence the selection of opportunity zones by governors. So just to start, the way that the zones were selected was first the Treasury put out a list of around 42,000 eligible census tracts in January of 2018. And as we know, tracts are neighborhoods anywhere between 2,500. Some very large tracts reach up to 8,000 people. And a tract was eligible if the median income was no greater than 80% of the area's median income, or if the tract had a poverty rate over 20%. So these were, distressed tracts based on income and poverty. Now from that, as David mentioned, each governor then selected up to 25% of those tracts as opportunity zones. And then once they submitted those lists back to the Treasury reviewed those lists and then announced the final list of tracts basically between May and June of 2018. And so broadly, what we're looking at in the paper is how were these tracts selected by governors? And specifically, we're going to focus on what was the role of politics in affecting the opportunity zone selection process. We have 3 specific research questions we're addressing in this paper. The first one is, to what extent did governors select areas that were politically aligned? So what were they selecting? To what extent did governors pick an area based on being of the same political party as the governor? Secondly, and the reason that we might expect to observe this is one, perhaps these politically aligned areas were places that the governor was more familiar with and through that had superior information about those areas best poised to benefit. Alternatively, perhaps they were picking these areas as a way to reward those aligned constituencies. Now, once we study whether or not the political affiliation played a role in the selection, the second thing that we look at in the paper is, well, what types of information was used or how transparent were these states about the selection process, and did that alter the role of political affiliation? So we're interested in understanding the types of inputs that states used in order to making these decisions, and to do so, we're going to collect information on the different types of selection processes. And then finally, the third question we're going to look at is based on our assessment of early outcomes. And as Kenan mentioned, it's been quite early. The data that we have access to right now primarily is through 2019, which is before a lot of investment seemed to flow into opportunity zones. But using what data we do have, we're going to see if there were any types of outcomes were affected or varied based on the role of political affiliation. Okay, so as Kenan highlighted, there were a lot of critiques about the opportunity zone selection process, including a letter from some congressional members to the Treasury stating that some of these tracts should be reevaluated and perhaps no longer qualify for opportunity zone treatment. But as Kenan also mentioned, we've seen that there's been a lot of investment flowing into different places. And so our role here is really to approach this from an agnostic academic perspective and really try to understand how these different zones were indeed selected. So the way that we do this is that we take the sample of all of the tracts that were eligible that we have data for. So it's almost 99% of those eligible tracts that were published by the Treasury. And then we're going to compare tracts that were selected. So in this map that you see, we're going to compare those that were selected, the red tracts, to those that were eligible but not selected, the tan tracts. And as I mentioned, all of those that were eligible all had to meet those statutory requirements based on the poverty rate and the median income. And so they all meet these 2 statutory requirements, and we're going to look to see to what extent were those that picked differ from those that were not picked as a function of not only tract characteristics, but also this idea of political affiliation. Now, when I say political affiliation, the construct or the underlying economic concern that we're interested in here is whether or not that local area was of the same party as the governor. So what was the local political affiliation of the constituency? Now, in order to measure that empirically, we're actually going to look to see what was the revealed political preference of those constituents based on their local state representative. So who was the state representative that the local area selected for the lower house, or here the assembly in California, to see if that individual was of the same party of the governor. And we're going to test this using an empirical specification, a linear probability model, where we regress the indicator if an area was selected on our same party indicator variable, if the area was of the same party, along with the 2 statutory requirements and other census tract characteristics. And the goal of including those other measures is to understand the extent to which other demographic characteristics informed or helped to influence the selection by governors. So in our first test, we present the results primarily of just those other characteristics, not including political affiliation. And what we find is that indeed these other demographic characteristics played a really important role. For example, a 1 percentage point increase in the poverty rate, for example, resulted in around a 2% increase in the likelihood that an area was picked. We find similar inferences when we look at median income. So collectively, these first 2 mean that conditional on already being a distressed area, governors were more likely to pick even more distressed, even poorer locations from that pool of already low income tracts. We also find that governors were more likely to pick more populous areas, areas where the policy would potentially affect more constituents. And then we used 2 measures from the Urban Institute that our discussant Brett here was pretty integral in developing. Let me highlight one of them. We look at whether or not an area was improving in preceding periods. If an area demonstrated different metrics of socioeconomic change, the latter measure investment score signals whether or not an area was improving in terms of capital investment flowing into the area, which will relate, a lot to the second paper you'll see here. And we find really large effects. So for example, if an area seemed to be improving, there was around a 40% increase that a governor was likely to select that area. We then introduce our political affiliation variable, the variable selecting or variable identifying whether or not the area was of the same political affiliation. And we do indeed find that there appears to be around an 8% increase, so larger than the effects of some of those other demographic characteristics like population and poverty rate, that an area was selected if it was of the same political party as the governor. So in summary, for our first research question, what we find is that on average, governors seem to choose opportunity zone tracts that were poorer, more populous, already improving, some would say gentrifying, and of the same political party. So then in the second part of our paper, we then look to see, well, what was the type of information that governors used to alter that influence of political affiliation? Or was there other information that was either a substitute for the role of political affiliation, or maybe in some cases even perhaps a complement? And we think this part of the paper is particularly important because there was very little public information about opportunity zones present during the selection period. So there wasn't a lot of information in the press, there wasn't a lot of information with the public constituents about this. So really all of the information came from the Treasury to the governors and then from the governors down to the local communities. So as evidence of that, I'm showing a graph here that's basically plotting Google Trends or Google searches for just the term opportunity zone in the early months as a way to demonstrate how little was known really outside of those individuals making the decision. And the black line here is the date by which almost all of the zones had been, or I think the date by which all zones had been identified and announced by Treasury. So you can see very little information. Obviously, there's more information that ticks up later as some of the regulatory guidance starts to come out from the Treasury in the fall of 2019 and again in 2020. Or sorry, in the fall of 2018 and again in 2019. Okay, so in the absence of this information, what was the type of information used by governors? So we go and collect, we have 4 individuals, including me, and other individuals with PhDs, go and collect information that we can find about the selection processes to understand what information was available in the selection decision. And so I want to give you an example of 2 different extremes. So one of the things that we did was we transcribed a number of different videos or webinars that we found either during or after the selection process. And I want to give a sense of the type of information that we're collecting. So the first is going to be from the New Mexico Economic Development Department. There, the governor relegated or really charged that economic development department to go out and to engage with the local communities in order to help identify those zones. And I'd call this kind of a bottom-up approach. And so we find here, there's a lot of text, but I'll read a few pieces of it here. There was a webinar basically in early March of 2018 where the state level representative from the economic development is asking, or is talking with local leaders and talking with them about the selection process. And they say, our role is simple. We're working with the governor's office to create a list of the recommended opportunity zones by gathering the inputs of all county managers and stakeholders. We are very, very much hoping and asking that all county managers work very closely with economic development organizations, county leaders, the Council of Governments, tribal leaders. All interested stakeholders should participate and prioritize the qualified census tracts that they are trying to nominate. And then it goes on to talk about how this person will then, submit an application and a prioritized list up to the governor. Once they compile these recommendations, the governor will review and then submit the list to the Treasury. And they close by saying, we will help make available our regional representatives to guide you through this process. So this is one example of a type of a state level involvement that then really works with the local leaders to identify those opportunity zones. Now, on a different example, what we found was a discussion by, for example, the governor of Mississippi, which seemed to be much more of a top-down approach. And so this is at a webinar, the quote that I'll read here in a minute is at a webinar that occurred in 2019, in the fall of 2019, where he's talking about the selection decision. And so the discussion is, a lot of people wanted to know, how did you pick out these 100 areas? So that, again, this is Mississippi Governor Phil Bryant discussing this election. He says, like there's something to know. Oh, we have to find out. Oh, he knows people there. I know half of Mississippi. No, I know 2/3 of Mississippi. If you're going to be governor, if you're going to end up knowing, you will end up knowing 2/3 of Mississippi. And we're just a big neighborhood in Mississippi. Most of us are related to each other. If you take a dart and throw it at a map in Mississippi, I'm going to be able to say, oh yeah, I know exactly who lives there. I probably got relatives who live there. So what we tried to do, and I think we successfully did, is we tried to be fair to everyone. So we just tried not to pick Northeast Mississippi because Southwest Mississippi would say we didn't get our fair share. Now, there's certainly more information about both of these states. We collect a lot of different examples when we go through. So I'm just trying to highlight the type of additional work we do to understand the other types of information that informed governor's decisions. So what we do is once we go through all of this information, we classify this into different categories. And I would say this is a part of our paper that we're still really working on. As David mentioned, there's still a lot of work being done. This is certainly a part that we're going through and revisiting a lot. But currently the version that I believe is posted publicly classifies the different types of processes that we find based on the engagement of professionals. So that can be external individuals, or it can be like consultants that are hired, or it can be individuals in an economic development department, whether at the state level or the local level. If a state allowed for public comment, like happened here in California, or if there was some type of application process. And what we see when we look at these different types of processes is that if we can't find any evidence of no formal process, which doesn't mean there wasn't necessarily, no process, but we can't observe any evidence of that throughout the selection period, the likelihood of relying on that political affiliation to make the choice increases to almost 26%. We start to see, some evidence that if indeed it appears that the governor, whether it was, worked with outside consultants, worked with the Economic Development Board, or allowed the public to comment on a set of proposed tracks, we see that role of political affiliation appears to decline or even go away. And so what we really conclude from this analysis is that it does appear that these different types of information used were really critical in basically either allowing that political affiliation to come through or to completely offset it. All right, so then in the third part of the paper, we try to look at some early outcomes. Again, the data is pretty early, but we want to understand if political affiliation thus far, based through early 2019, was affecting any of the outcomes that we were seeing. And we wanted to use this as a way to figure out, does this political affiliation, was it something that was just, rewarding aligned constituencies, or was it actually, quality information that helped inform and select better areas? And so to do so, we study the area that Kenan was mentioned that has been the first to respond, and that's the real estate industry. So we look at the number of commercial real estate transactions using address level data, new construction building permits, also looking at the address level, so we can perfectly map those to census tracts. And then at a less granular level, we have construction employment at the county level. And you'll note again that the date through which these data are observed is really through 2019. So unfortunately, we don't have the data yet to look through perhaps more increased inactivity in 2020, and thus view this as pretty early analyses. And our assumption here is that greater investment in these same party areas might be more optimal selections, or less optimal if we see less investment. And that hinges on two pretty important assumptions: that this is actually the right type of investment that should be happening from an opportunity zone. Certainly, we don't know that that's the case, and there's reasons to think those assumptions don't hold. But under those, we're going to be able to try and use these tests to say something about political affiliation. All right, so I know I'm running short on time, so let me highlight these last couple of results here. So what we do is we use a triple diff strategy, including tract fixed effects, year quarter fixed effects, and we study if, for example, the number of commercial real estate transactions increases in an area after it was selected, and we test whether or not any increase varies based on the role of political affiliation. All right, so we look at these three different outcomes you can see here: commercial real estate transactions, building permits, and construction employment. On average, we find a positive effect, implying that there is more activity, whether it's in terms of transactions or building permits, in all of these different areas after an area is selected. And interestingly, we find across three wildly different data sets that we're using here, we also see the same pattern of results. We see a coefficient that appears negative but is not statistically significant, implying that there's no difference yet in these same party areas. And I'll just graph these for you here. So we see some effect that appears to be spiking after the zone selection. But then when we split this based on whether or not an area is the same party, we observe something that seems, the red pieces here seem lower, but they are not statistically different. Okay, so in conclusion, what decides where opportunity knocks? Based on our analysis, we think that there's some really important demographic characteristics, but political affiliation does seem to matter. We also demonstrate the type of information that is used plays a critical role in the selection decision. And based on our early analysis, we don't see much in the way of early outcomes varying. And so certainly would like to continue to augment that analysis with additional data as it becomes available. We think this is really important for any future evaluation of the policy. You'll see some other papers today also try to tackle this selection question when they're looking at outcomes. And as Kenan was mentioning, to the extent that tracts are revisited, whether it's through the process of removing high income tracts, whether it's because of the more recent census data and having to tackle some of these really large tracts that were split, we think that understanding the selection decision is really important for any future empirical evaluation. All right, so thank you very much. Thank you very much to Brett for being willing to discuss the paper, and again for including our work in the conference today.
Great. I've got one question, but we'll save it for after the presentation. So now I'd like to turn to the next paper, and I guess Ofer Eldar and Chelsea Garber are going to do some kind of duet. I'm not sure how this is going to work, but I'll leave it to them.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much for the opportunity to present in this conference and for organizing it. I will be talking about my joint work with Chelsea Garber, Does Government Play Favorites? Evidence from Opportunity Zones. So let me start. I mean, we don't need to introduce again the specifics of the program, but one thing I'll say is that our paper takes on a little bit the idea that Professor Ed Glaeser already mentioned, which is the Opportunity Zone programs is really designed to foster investment. If you look at the stated purpose in the legislative document, it says specifically that the purpose of the program is encouraging economic growth and investment in distressed communities by providing federal tax benefit to businesses located within designated boundaries. And as already identified, in the previous paper, and in fact, we identified this very early on, as early as 2019. We already posted some preliminary evidence on the selection process. A key feature of this program is that the governors choose the tracks based on their own discretion. And to the best of our knowledge, no other program or laws actually give governors the power to do something similar, which is basically distribute, federal tax benefit to essentially to specific investors in specific locations. So the question we really focused on is whether or not these features give rise to some kind of political favoritism. Now, in terms of the broader question, this feature really goes to the design of government programs to promote development, right? So we contrast this approach of the OZ program, which I'm going to call the lax approach, with the merit-based approach of the Community Development Financial Institution program, right? If you think about about the OZ program, the governors, as I already said, can just choose the tracts based on their own discretion. And the funds that invest in the OZs basically qualify for tax credit based on self-reporting without any disclosure requirement, right? If you contrast this with CDFI, there's a certification of financial institutions that might direct 60% of the financing activities to low-income areas. And also they must apply for government subsidies based on a competitive process and enter into an assistance agreement with the CDFI fund, which is housed in the Treasury Department, right? Now, there is a reason for this laxity, right? The reason is that the OZ program is supposed to have a much broader scope than the CDFI program and draw the mainstream investors into distressed areas. So again, there's an emphasis here on the investment aspect, right? So if you look again, I know we already saw some media reports. You see this tension between laxity and scope, right? So really reflected in the media report. There's a lot of optimism in the beginning, but shortly thereafter, there's some concerns about the allocation of OZs by the governors and suggestions that they were intended to benefit the wealthy investors, right? So, so the main research question again is basically whether favoritism predicts OZ designation. And we focus on two main measures. One is voter support for the governor at the county level. And the idea again is that governors would reward tracts that voted for them. And importantly, we also focus on investor contributions based on campaign contributions to the governor's election. Of course, we also control and look at economic factors like income, poverty, lots of others, and also whether or not these income and poverty measures are increasing or decreasing prior to the designation, right? Finally, this is not yet in the paper, but we have some preliminary evidence on the impact of designation and favoritism on investment in startup, which again is what the program was supposed to encourage. Let's keep the institutional, more of the institutional background. I want to say something again, even if discretion is not subject to any review, there's some guidance in the legislative notes that basically says that governors should give actually consideration to some particular factors. Again, we're talking about attracting investments and fostering startup activities. We want to designate areas that already had success as recipients of other tax credit. And in fact, we control for that, whether or not the tract was, essentially already included in another program, such as the CDFI program or an empowerment zone. And whether it experienced significant layoffs due to business closures or relocations. Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna. I don't want to talk too much about how we construct the data, but I do want to focus on how we construct our investor favoritism variable. Okay, so the way we do this, we use data from Follow the Money. We identify governor in office at the time of OZ selection for each state. We keep campaign contributions above $1,000 to the governor in the pre-OZ election cycle and the 2018 cycle if applicable. We then use data from Venture Expert, which is data on startup investments. We construct aggregate private investments for each tract from 2003 to 2018. We identify investor firm and investee company executives. We match this to the Follow the Money data based on first and last name, and again, to the campaign contribution. So we associate investor contribution with census tract where each investee company is located. So again, just to give you sort of a slightly graphic, slightly better idea of what we're actually doing. So basically, if you're an executive that donated to the election of the Arizona governor, then the tract in which, in this case, let's say Kovac is located will be associated with investor contribution. Now, the same goes to contribution from executive in Kovac, contribution by the company Kovac itself, by AVC Capital, the investors, or the executive in ABC. These are all hypothetical, of course, so I don't want to associate specifically with these names. So this is just one example. Okay, so another thing we do in order to validate our measures, we looked at lots of newspaper reports, right? So we looked at all the news reports that looked at questionable designation. And these include things like tracts in Manhattan, which is home to offices of Pershing Square, right? That became an opportunity zone. 4 tracts in Portland in the 93rd percentile in median income among, the low-income communities, low-income tracts that are basically eligible for selection. Tract in Houston, Texas, that as of 2017 had a median family income of $250,000, right? So we collected all these reports, and we sort of validated also our favoritism measure using that, because we also find that a high percentage of these tracts are located in counties with more than 60% voter support for the governor, compared to 40% of all the OZs, and 14 tracts, 31%. Located in tracts with more than $1,000 investor contribution, compared to 3% for all the other all the other opportunity zones. Okay, so we first look at the distribution of the stress measure. Again, this shows you the number of designated OZ by in-state percentile of different measure of distress. So overall, this is a preliminary evidence. We see that the more distressed tract the more likely it is to be selected, which is sort of good news. But at the same time, we see that many relatively wealthy tracts were selected, which might still be okay, but it gives us some reasons to potentially be concerned about the selection process. So I'm going to skip straight to the regressions in the interest of time. So here we show marginal effect from a logic regression. So the first finding here is that voter support is not statistically significant without the full set of controls, but we include the full set of controls of education, home prices, et cetera, et cetera. Tracts are about 5% more likely to be selected. So this is consistent with the idea that governors may be rewarding voter support. Importantly, we find that tracts that are associated with investor contribution are about 7% more likely to be selected. So this is a fairly significant effect. Other findings, we do find that private investment does predict selection, and that's important. Also, poverty and unemployment rates, as we already found, trending upwards, weakly predict designation, as we see, mainly in terms of things like median family income. Now, we're very worried about selection issues, right, in studies like this. In part because tracks associated with voter support and investor contribution have different characteristics than other tracks. So in any research study, you really have to take selection very, very seriously, right? So we do a bunch of things. One is we use matching estimators, right, where we basically match tracks that have voter support and importantly investor contribution associated with the track with other, to other similar tracks, and we look, and we look at the effect of investor contribution and voter support, and the matching criteria. We use different models, and we find again results that generally support the same hypothesis. We also account for unobservables, like the possibility that there's some unobserved factors that affect the governor selection. And we follow methods by Altonji and Oster, where basically we calculate the lower bounds of the effect of favoritism as if unobservable factors determine selection, and using the standard assumption in the literature. And again, we find that basically the bounds still suggest that there is favoritism does predict OZ designation. So this is just to give you a sense. The estimates from different matching model of the investor contribution variable. So that suggests that investor contribution does predict, has a larger effect than what we find in the standard regression. It's about 10% or even more higher likelihood of OZ designation. Okay, so we also do the bounding exercise, and basically the conventional assumption, which is that the unobservables would improve the prediction of OZ designation by 30%. The lower bound of the association between favoritism and designation is still positive. Okay. Importantly, we also do counterfactuals, which is sort of an interesting exercise, and I think here we can interpret this in a couple of different ways. But I'll show you, we do different counterfactual, but the basic idea is what we do here, we shut down the favoritism variable. In this graph that I'm showing you now, we shut down both the voter favoritism and also the investor favoritism. And we basically examine if the distribution of tracks based on distress measures would change without favoritism. So here we show the 700 tracks whose selection status would change when we shut down the favoritism measure. So favoritism affects about 10% of the selected tracks. So you can argue whether that's a lot or not a lot. Many of the tracks that would be selected would still be in the same percentiles in terms of median family income. These are the dark green bars. But we still see a pretty substantial shift from relatively wealthy tracks, about 20% of the tracks. So these are the red bars, the tracks that would be selected without favoritism, to the green bars, the tracks that would be selected, right? So the red bars, these are the ones that would not be selected. There's a shift to the green bars, the poorer ones. Okay? So this suggests that a sizable number of wealthy tracks do not necessarily deserve the OC designation. We do a lot of robustness tests. I'm not going to mention them now, but the final thing is that I want to show is that we start looking at the impact of favoritism on investment. And what we do here is basically we do a standard diff and diff or a triple diff and diff design. The dependent variable is the log of investment in essentially in businesses and startups. We look at both early stage investment and also at late stage investment in a track in each quarter, before and after, right, the OZ designation. We interact OZ designation with investor contribution and with quarter dummies to see how investment evolves over time. We control for track and county year fixed effects and cluster at the track level. So it's a fairly robust specification. Our preliminary findings suggest the OZ designation has no effect on investment level. Maybe there are a lot of success stories here and there, but at least for mainstream startup, we don't observe any major impact. And specifically, investor favoritism, the triple interaction, seems to have no effect except for a jump in the late stage investment in the first quarter after designation, right? So I'll show you just this graph. This is the late stage investment in tracks that are designated and also associated with investor favoritism. And you see a big jump in the first quarter after the designation, but then a drop, back a drop. So this is very preliminary and very, can be interpreted. So I want to be very careful, but maybe there's some concerns here that maybe the designation was supposed to sort of benefit or maybe benefited some specific investors that, especially late stage investment, this late stage investment that immediately jumped on the opportunity to invest in these tracks, and then, but then we see a flattening or even a decline in investment afterwards.
Great.
Okay, so with that, I just want to conclude. Lax designation may be tainted by political favoritism and may result in allocating tax benefits to profit maximizing funds. On the bright side, governors do take into account economic distress in OZ designation. This seems to be a major factor. Too early to determine the outcomes, and we look forward to continuing to do more research on this. Thank you.
Brett Theodos, the discussant.
Great. Thanks so much, David, for planning this session. It's a really helpful synopsis and so timely. Thanks also to the authors. I really enjoyed these two papers. And thanks also to all the participants for joining in. This is a fun way to be able to do this, even though we're remote. It's still good to engage. So I'm Brett Theodos. I'm a senior fellow at the Urban Institute. I have been doing a lot of stuff around OZs, in part initially to guide. Oh, can you hear me?
Yep, good.
Great. Okay. And also to help understand the program and how it's playing out, and to help propose reforms and tweaks along the way. So we've done some assessment work looking at how the program is rolling out, more of it in a qualitative form, finding ways that it's built some new ecosystems and engaged some new actors, finding that it really hasn't done better or worse with respect to community engagement, resident engagement than other federal economic development programs, but also finding that many mission-based projects are struggling to be paired with investors, and there's some structural reasons for that. Certainly confirming the real estate bias of the program, somewhat related to exit strategies, and really fundamentally finding that OZs are needing to be paired with other subsidy tools, that it's too shallow a subsidy to kind of stand on its own feet, enable in the ability to produce impactful projects, communities locally. So one comment for the day that I'm bringing to this is really just to think of it as, by way of metaphor or analogy, I know these aren't RCT studies, but I think it's helpful to think of these more as an intent to treat than a treatment on the treated model. So think of it as studies assessing whether people signed up for their vaccine, not whether they got it. And I do want to reflect differently on the history of the program. I do not principally or solely blame reconciliation for the reason that we only have the ITT level insights. That is why we don't have data on where the program has gone to date. And we really don't know because the Trump administration intentionally chose to only collect information on tax forms that deliberately made it difficult to get off. And we could have had an alternative process with certification, whereby we know for opportunity funds, some required reporting, and there's really nothing to prevent that in a statute. So it's somewhat of a failure of how the bill came to life in a fully partisan manner with just budget reconciliation, but it's really also having to do with how it's administered. And then, of course, Congress hasn't yet acted to add more requirements. So I think it is also helpful as a frame. I view, when I bring the earlier comments about whether this is really OZs are a good illustration for other community development programs or processes, I think in some ways, yes, but in some ways, no. And I would encourage us to think more about 1031 exchanges and EB-5s than I would about new market tax credits and low-income housing tax credits and even empowerment zones. But to the papers, I really appreciated them. I thought there was a considerable amount of work that went into them. So kudos to the authors. They've definitely helped grow our evidence base about OZs. They're quite similar in question and approach, and thankfully they're similar in conclusions, which I take as very welcome replication that I would love to see more of in program evaluation. I know there's some journalistic pressure for every paper to be terminally unique, but I also think that means that most papers are dreadfully obscure. And so I want to congratulate the authors and hope they're confident in their contributions. So some specific comments I have that I can share in writing for the papers, but I'm going to focus on the bigger picture issues for the good of the whole group. First, I didn't emerge with real concerns about the modeling approaches. They felt strong to me. I did have some concerns more with some of the measures that were included that I'll talk to. Also, some, but I thought not all of the problems could be identified to map back to the time that zones were available to be picked in the first place. And so I was hoping from a policy frame and a transparency frame, it feels like a lot is loaded on governors, but there's going to be a few comments that I'm weaving through where I think I'd like us to contextualize the process a little more so that we don't quite so solely focus in on governors. And one of the issues that I see as a flaw in the legislation that really affected the limited ability to be transparent in this process and potentially led to some of these effects around the politicization of selection is just the short time frame, and that governors could kind of skate by without getting as much transparency on it. But I'd also like for that, similarly themed but different emphasis is for Treasury to have a more prominent narrative in the articles. So Treasury had the authority to review and to certify the zones that had been nominated. They were the designators. But they really did nothing productive or proactive to guide or to steer governors toward better choices. And they could have. And so in that sense, I would also like to see Treasury amplified. That role is missing, I think, from the essays in current form. I'm not a political scientist. I should have started with that mea culpa. And this is not principally the sort of thing that I study. I did do one paper in my undergrad thesis that did see that a program in Illinois was disproportionately awarded to competitive districts. So I was pleased to see in the paper that was playing favorites that you did incorporate that competitive district element. I would have liked to go even a little lower than the 50 to 60%, but maybe more 45 to 55, those real bubble places, and see that. And I would encourage a reflection, even though it didn't actually turn up to find anything, but it was something that I was asking myself for the Opportunity Knox paper. I thought that was important to at least grapple with, because I think a different theory to bring to this is governors tried to buy off places that they wanted to win, not just reward places that were already in their pocket, if you will. So I would also like to, this is my big push, and I know the rewards are maybe not built in, but I feel like there's this academic journal industrial complex that makes papers appear in a certain way. And I think that means in these cases that, from my view, you all have done terrific work, but have overleaned into the multivariate results at the expense of the descriptive. And I would love to see more state-by-state descriptives. 8 robustness checks and multiple model specifications. That's one audience in mind. And so maybe there needs to be a little bit of rendering to Caesar what is Caesar and God to what is God's. Like maybe you do something that's really more of the academic paper to only speak to the academics. But I think there is a policy audience that is interested in the conclusions of these papers. So if you can't get it in one product, I really would encourage you to create a separate product that digs into the state-by-state findings. And I was encouraged in the slides, not yet the paper, but trust it'll get there for the Opportunity Knocks one to really begin to dig in a little more to some of the state-specific examples. I really think some case studies or vignettes would be possible. I'd love to see states graded, you know, how high they were above and below expectations. I know there's a little bit in there that can be eked out, but I think that could be made more prominent. Get a score, a summary score. I think that would be highly policy relevant. And as part of that, and perhaps bridging back to my comment about the lack of perhaps the importance of governors or the full importance of governors as might come through in reading the essays, is really then through these case studies or other examples is to try to dig into more about how governors really did this selecting. So I know of governors and examples where they said, okay, all of you county executives, we're going to give you the authority and you tell us which zones you nominate. Or, you know, to lift up a different example, Illinois, you know, the governor says to Mayor Emanuel in Chicago, tell me which zones you want and I will put them in. And sometimes it really was just, you know, Mayor Emanuel deciding Chicago and giving it to the governor of Illinois. Sometimes it was more of a suggestion approach, and then the governor might still tweak it. But I think it's important to dig into from a policy and a conclusion perspective, because you're loading a lot on the political affiliation of the governor. But in reality, that's not how all the processes played out. And so I think in that sense, the papers can feel overly simplistic to how the actual context and decision-making was made. And so my encouragement to be nothing against the webinars, and I like that you're digging into those, that was encouraging. But just between all of the papers that are looking at this, split up the 50 states plus DC and do some interviews. You know, some of the people in those positions have left their jobs and will probably speak pretty candidly now. They probably, you know, especially if they were off the record. I mean, a lot of the participants on this very webinar know a lot of the states and how they actually played out. And so I'd encourage you to try to dig in more. And then I think this could be quantified and you could make some real classifications of how governors really did the selection process that can then inform the politicization question. And I think it could be an improvement upon, I liked the line of thinking in the paper that looked at the channels, the information channels, but I worried those were endogenous and that the kind of governor who was more likely to have this kind of process was also the kind of governor who was more willing to make these kinds of choices. And so I don't take that as a true problem. I mean, it's still interesting to see, but I think one could emerge with a conclusion of, oh, if a governor just had a process, then we would have had a different outcome. And I think that's where it's more to me symptom than cause. But I think digging into some of the process on a state-by-state basis, again, I don't think too big a lift for all 50 states or all those you could get would be a really valuable addition. And in terms of the paper's structure, I did feel like it was a lot to cram in the selection and some of the outcome analysis. So I'll defer to you, but my read would have been to try to split those into separate papers. And then a bigger question on the measurement and some of the variables. I wondered, and I don't know these data as well as you do, so you can answer in a minute, but why not look at party affiliation data and get a more granular spatial focus? I didn't like the use of counties. LA County has 10.4 million people. And similarly for the same party designation, I wonder, and the recent election, I wonder if we could just look more contemporaneously at, affiliation data. I liked the inclusion of the follow the money political donor data. I thought that was a nice addition, but I didn't like the emphasis on venture capital and private equity. And I still felt it was somewhat funny to have all these barrage of robustness checks, but then miss, for example, like real estate developers, who to me stand out as the biggest beneficiary of this program and the most influential in helping governors or encouraging or cajoling governors to make decisions. So it felt a little odd to put so much. I mean, you know, we know that 3% of the program so far is going to operating businesses. So it really is a real estate program. And yet, you know, that's not, you kind of could read the paper and think, wow, you really modeled that. And it didn't emerge feeling that way. Small comment, I was interested in nonlinear specifications for poverty and income in particular, because I think there was potentially a sweet spot that's not the most distressed and perhaps not the least distressed. So if there's nothing there in the effects, there's nothing there, but I was interested in learning that. And then I did like the frame about the analysis that looked at, you know, without favoritism, 10% of tracks wouldn't have been selected. And without favoritism, 20% of those designations would have been shifted. I think that's a really powerful statistic that I would elevate up. And the other paper may want to consider something similar. I didn't like excluding DC in the Opportunity Knox paper and excluding contiguous tracks in the Playing Favorites paper. More people than Wyoming had a legitimate selection process. And if it's too liberal, so are some other states, you know, not maybe that much, but approaching that much partisanship in either direction. And similarly, contiguous tracks are really important, I think, in understanding the program. I thought the importance of gentrification as an empirical driver really relates to the structural elements of the incentive and what's built in. And so wrapping up, I think, you know, many of us saw potential for manipulation in this program's design before it was statute. And so in that sense, you know, and the media have certainly documented that anecdotally. So in that sense, the papers aren't telling us things we fundamentally don't know, but I think they are really helpful in putting a number on it. I didn't especially like the framing of, you know, engage professional advisors as though that's a solution. And I think really, you know, there is this underlying implicit critique of governors when I think more could be done to criticize the program design that allowed such latitude to begin with, and Treasury administration that provided no oversight. And last point is, I think the papers could lean just a little bit more into why the zone selection matters so much. And that is, you know, to lift up by way of illustration, in new markets, we have community development entities that apply competitively. And you do say that, but to bring in the implication that, you know, a minority of zones could get a majority of OZ capital. And so in that sense, it matters much more than the low-income housing tax credit or, you know, new markets or some of these other tools, what the zone selection was. So I think that could be amplified a bit. Okay, thank you so much for the chance to comment. I really enjoyed the papers.
Thank you very much, Brett. That was very comprehensive. We're a little behind schedule, so I'm just going to blow through the break so that we can get to some questions. If the people on the Zoom call have a question, raise your hand. I'm going to read one question, and then I'm going to ask David Newmark if he wants to comment. Michael Snydal, apologies if I've pronounced the name wrong, says that in both papers, the explanatory power, the R squared, is limited. How does the authors deal with this limitation? Is this a story of noisy data and a lot of variability in where opportunity knocks? I think I want to take three questions and then let the authors respond. David Newmark, we can call on you if you want, if you're on the, if you're still with us, or if not, I'll.
Can you hear me?
Yes, David, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask, I guess it's Becky, not Rebecca, looking at the name in your box. You know, you showed, I think in your selection slides, that places that were, I think it was called socioeconomic change, which I guess is improving, improving places got selected, all else the same. Then you have sort of a simple two-way fixed effects model and find a positive effect of actually being selected. Suggests that you need to really be concerned about the path places are on in inferring a causal effect. So I wonder if you did more on that.
Great. Is there anybody else who wants to ask a question orally? If not, we'll just turn to those two. Why don't we turn to those two? Authors, whoever wants to speak, speak.
I'll go ahead and just respond to that question from David. So it's an excellent question and one that we've grappled a lot with. So I would say the big picture that we're grappling with our paper is something that Brett hit upon. Thank you, Brett, for your comments as well, which is like, do we put the outcomes in or not? And we keep getting mixed evidence or mixed feedback on that, like whether that's part of the paper or not. However, thinking just about the effect that you're talking about, two empirical things that we've tried, or one we've tried to do and another one that we are in the process of attempting to do is exactly to address this issue. We know they're improving beforehand, and based on the score we have from the Urban Institute, there aren't that many that actually have that. So we have worked with an entropy balancing approach to try to come up with some more synthetic controls that would allow us to hopefully control for that. But the number of tracks that were kind of coded as improving is limited. So we're weighting a lot of, we're putting heavy weights on a very few number of tracks. So the second approach that we've talked about is doing more of like a regression discontinuity, where we're trying to maybe look at some tracks that were improving in preceding periods, but we're just above that 20% poverty rate, or the 80, right below that 80% or the other way on the median income, and see if we can use those for some better identification. So it is certainly a concern that we're quite worried about and are hoping to address and tackle a bit more empirically once we determine if that piece of the paper will continue or if we spin that out into something else.
And Ofer or Chelsea on the R-squared question?
Yeah, so let me step in. Question I would know whether the R-squared is high enough or not high enough is sort of can be a little bit subjective here, right? So it's now regressions, it's around 10%. But one thing that I will say is that this is why it's so important to do some of the exercises we do with respect to matching, and also try to think about selection on unobservables, right? So this is why we do the bounding exercise. And we show that even if you take into account that there's some unobservables that could affect the selection, the estimates are still bounded with a positive coefficient, right? So by positive coefficient. And so likelihood, it still seems to be the case that favoritism has some impact on the OZ designation, even if there might be unobservables. Right, we don't also know the direction of the unobservables, right? But so even if there might be some unobservables that might mitigate some of the, effects that we see in the data.
Ofer and Chelsea, I got an email from John Lettieri at EIG, who's says that on the stuff that you haven't yet put in the paper, he basically says, give me a break. You wouldn't expect to see much activity in startups 1 quarter in, given how the business works, and also given that the regulations on businesses came later. I'm just passing that along.
So let me, I'll connect it to the question by Brett, because he mentioned this thing about the issue of that start. So first of all, the venture expert data does include some data, it does include data on rates. So let me say that. So first, so it's not, it's private equity venture capital broadly defined. But again, so we gotta see what we're looking at, right? First, we're looking at investments. We're not looking at some outcomes, right? Or like some outcome of revenues or something like that, right? So we're looking at investments. We're not necessarily, first of all, this is also not in the paper, going back to what, the other issue, the other point that Brett raised, whether we should include the impact and lump it together with the selection process in one paper, right? So this is still not in the paper. This is just preliminary evidence that we're showing. Now, we're open to the idea that perhaps we're going to see investment later down the road, right? That's very possible. I will point out one thing, which is the way that the program is designed. It's actually you get there's some incentives within the program to make the investment relatively early, right? So when you actually the earlier you make the investment and use the capital gains and to invest in OZs, it's a bit more complicated, the specifics of this, but the earlier, the more tax credits you will be able to get. So there are some investment to invest early. Now, I'm not overruling that we're going to see effects, in the long term. I mean, this is what we're here to examine, but that's, but it's worth mentioning that there are some incentive to invest early. And one more thing I would like to say just before I move to the next question. So it is true that, in practice, this program, is sort of drawing the real estate investors potentially, right? But that's not what it's supposed to do, right? Based on what you read in the legislative comments, right? So that's the key. That's sort of why we're trying to focus on what it is supposed to do, right? So in that respect, looking at startup activity, could be, is arguably the correct thing to look at.
Chelsea, you want to weigh in here? I don't want you to be left out.
I just wanted to jump in on another point Brett made, actually, which was this idea of rewarding voters versus trying to attack these marginal districts. We did go through kind of every iteration of binning these voting percentages. We looked at the 45 to 50, the 50 to 55. We even tried kind of a running regression discontinuity to see if we could, detect anything there. Another idea that I had was looking at some of the governors were term limited. So you might think they might be less sensitive in some ways to trying to turn these marginal districts, but that's a little tough because then it's obviously really correlated with some of these state policies and stuff, and you have a low sample size. But point well taken. I think, we didn't have strong priors on what we would see, but really our results show up at that 60 to 70% rewarding the voters.
Becky, did you want to respond to anything that Brett said before we move on to the next panel?
I'll just say thank you. I know we're kind of over time, so there's a lot of comments for us to digest, and I'm really grateful, Brett, for your time, and it was a pleasure to be included in the same session as Ofer and Chelsea's paper as well.
Great.
So thank you.
I'm going to keep us on schedule, so thank you all, both for the very well-ordered presentations and Brett for that incredibly comprehensive commentary.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.